Chapter 5. The following morning was hectic as Tracy washed Maddie's hair for her and gave her a bath after breakfast. She had meant to bathe her the night before, but she'd forgotten, so she had woken Andy up extra early to have him carry the tub in and help her fill it. They had each bathed before emptying the tub and refilling it. She washed Maddie immediately after breakfast, but they left the tub in their bedroom for the boys to take their turns in. Tracy sat Maddie on the floor at her feet in the kitchen and combed the tangles from her long blonde hair. She then braided it carefully and pinned it atop Maddie's head, making sure it looked just right for church. Tracy looked at the old dress the young girl was wearing and wished she'd taken the time to make her a new one. It was clean, but it was much too small. It barely covered her knees. By next Sunday, she'd have the new dress made, even if it meant staying up all night on Saturday night getting it ready. All three of the males wore shirts and ties for Sunday dress, but the shirts were too tight. The two boys had pants that were too short. She had a lot of sewing to do to make them look how they should. She was tired just thinking about the work her new family was causing her, but it was a good tired. Just before leaving the house, Tracy put the pot of beans onto the stove to boil so they would be ready when they arrived home. It wasn't her favorite dish, but it would be ready when they arrived home, so it made sense that it was what she fixed. The drive to town seemed much shorter than usual, and Tracy was excited to meet the other people at church. She had been to church every Sunday since she was a small child, so it felt strange that she'd missed the 2 weeks before, even though she'd been on a train and there had been no way she could make it. "Is everyone friendly?" she asked Andy as she sat close to him on the seat. He used one hand to drive the gentle team and the other held hers tightly. Andy smiled down at her. "It's a congregation made up of the ranching families in the area and all their hands. It's primarily men, so you will be the center of attention." Tracy sighed. "Stay close to me then. I don't want other men touching me like what happened in town the other day." She hadn't enjoyed John's attentions, but she had secretly liked how Andy had reacted to the other man. She didn't think Andy would have come around nearly as quickly if he hadn't realized there were other men interested in her as well. "You didn't tell them we were unhappy, did you? Because if you did, it will be all over town already." Tracy shook her head. "I barely got a word in edgewise. They knew we were married, but I didn't say much more. Thank you for not shaming me in front of the town." Andy took a deep breath. "I probably deserved it." "No, you didn't. You reacted in a normal way. Your brother sent away for a bride for you. How were you supposed to react?" Tracy understood his motivation behind what he'd said better now, because she'd taken the time to think about it and not just see things through her own eyes and hurt feelings. "As soon as I saw you, I should have gotten down on the ground and kissed his feet." Tracy laughed. "I know I'm not a raving beauty." She looked back over her shoulder at Maddie. "I have a feeling Maddie will be, though. It's going to be fun to see what kind of man she's attracted to." Andy shook his head. "It will. I hope she's only attracted to good men. The idea of her marrying a man who isn't good for her is frightening." He stopped the wagon in front of the church and set the brake. She could see that several families simply left their wagons in the churchyard, and it looked as if that's what he would do as well. The three in the back got down quickly and went to talk with their friends. She noted that Francis immediately went to a group of boys who were standing beside the church talking about something, while Maddie went to a group of young girls, and Arthur went to a group of boys who were throwing a ball. Andy walked around the wagon and helped her down, his arm automatically going around her waist. "Would you like me to introduce you to a few of the wives?" Tracy nodded, feeling strange that he would automatically introduce her to other wives instead of girls in school. Yes, she was a wife, but she had been a girl in school just a couple of weeks before. It was odd how her life had changed so quickly. He made the rounds with her, introducing her to the 5 women who attended the church. There were at least 50 people there, but as he'd said, most were ranch hands. There were a few children, which balanced things out a little. Tracy found herself the center of attention, with man after man coming over and letting her know that if she got tired of Andy, they would be waiting. As soon as they went to their seats, she leaned over to whisper, "Don't they believe in marriage?" "Yes, they do, but they want a wife, and don't know how to find one." His lips against her ear sent a shiver of passion through her body. She immediately felt guilty about feeling that way in church, but she didn't know how to stop it. God had given her feelings of passion, hadn't he? Maddie sat down in the pew next to Tracy. "I'll give them Elizabeth's address." "Who's Elizabeth?" he asked. "The owner of the mail-order bride agency that placed me with you." She watched as Arthur and Frances slipped into the pew on the other side of Tracy. The sermon was short and sweet, and Tracy was shocked when at the end, she was welcomed into the community and invited to stand by the pastor. She stood, blushing, wishing he hadn't done that, but at the same time understanding she'd get to know people faster that way. One of the women she'd met before, Abigail, a girl near her age with a baby on her hip, rushed to her side after the sermon. "Would your family like to join ours for Sunday dinner?" Tracy looked at Andy, who didn't give any indication that he cared one way or the other. "I have a pot of beans on the stove cooking. Maybe next week?" Abigail nodded. "We'd like that. I'll see you then." After several minutes of visiting with others, Tracy followed Andy to the wagon. He helped her up onto the seat, and the kids climbed into the back. "The people here seem really nice," Tracy said to Andy. "Oh, they are. I think you'll like it here. It's just like any small town, though, so don't tell anyone anything you don't want the entire town to be talking about next week." Tracy smiled. "I'll do my best." Asterisk. The impeccably dressed man with shiny black shoes caused a sensation as he stepped off the train in nowhere. He went straight to the mercantile, because that seemed the place to get information. George, the proprietor, looked up from his dusting. "What can I do for ya?" "I'm looking for a woman who I am told has just moved here." "Her name is Tracy." George frowned slightly. "What about her?" He was wary as he asked the question, his eyes darkening, and he immediately looked unfriendly. "I've been hired to find her." "Do you know where she is?" While the town was small, and constantly talking about their own, they didn't do so to strangers. Tracy may have been a newcomer to nowhere, but she was also one of their own now that she'd married Andy Harvey. "Never heard of her." "So you're saying that no young woman has moved to this town?" Andy left his hand on her shoulder, indicating she should stay in her seat, before getting up and grabbing the man's arm, pulling him out of the church. "Who are you, and what do you want with my wife?" He'd been waiting to confront this man since he'd heard he was in town. The man sighed. "I'm a private detective. Tracy's mother hired me to find her." "Tracy doesn't have a mother. She was left on the doorstep of a church." The stranger indicated a bench in front of the church. "My name is Stephen Chandler. Tracy's mother came to me a month ago and told me the whole story behind what happened. When Tracy was a week old, her father was killed in a fire. Their house was destroyed, and she and her mother were left penniless. Her mother searched for someone to take them both in, but couldn't find anyone. Finally, she took a job in Boston as a maid, but one of the requirements of the job was that she not have a child." Andy looked at the other man, listening to him. He didn't want their lives to change. "Go on." She decided to leave Tracy on the doorstep of a local orphanage with a note, saying she would be back for her. She had every intention of going back a month or 2 later, but the months turned into years. To make a long story short, her mother has married again, and her husband has agreed to let Tracy come and live with them. She'd have money and a life of leisure. Andy shook his head. No. She's my wife. Why would the man even think such a thing was possible? Women didn't just leave their husbands for better opportunities. Stephen sighed. She could have so much more than this life. Her mother is married to one of the wealthiest men in Boston. She could have a real life there. Andy stood. She has a real life here. Go away. He walked back into the church and sat down beside Tracy, his mind going over and over the words Steve had said in his mind. Should he let her go? Shouldn't she at least meet her mother? But what about Maddie? Maddie would hate him if he let Tracy go. After church, he grabbed Tracy's arm and hurried her out of the church, helping her into the wagon. He told Frances to get the other two and get into the wagon immediately. He needed to tell Tracy what had happened, but he wasn't about to do it in the churchyard with everyone listening in. As they drove, he told her what the other man had said, and Tracy sat worrying the skirt of her dress. I don't want to leave, she said in a whisper. But inside, she couldn't help but wonder what her mother was like. Her whole life she'd dreamed about what it would be like to have a real mother. And now she was being offered one? Now when she was finally with a family who loved her. She didn't want to leave, but she wanted to meet the woman who had given her life. Why had she left her on the doorsteps? And why hadn't she come back for her as she'd said she would? Why was she looking for her now? She asked Andy those questions, and he gave her the story Steve Chandler had told him. Tears streamed down her face. For the first time in her life, there was more than one person who wanted her, but they lived in different states. When they got home, Tracy served the roast she'd had in the oven while they were gone, but she just toyed with her own food. The children had no idea what had happened, but they could tell something was upsetting her. After lunch, she did the dishes with Maddie as always, and then announced she needed a nap. Maddie watched the door close with Tracy on the other side. Tracy never takes naps, Andy. What did you do? Her voice was filled with accusation. She obviously blamed Andy for Tracy's upset. Andy shook his head, not knowing how to answer that. Truly, he'd done nothing wrong, but his sister wouldn't see it that way. After a moment, he followed her into the bedroom and sat beside her on the bed, stroking her back. Do you want to meet your mother? He asked, feeling as if his heart was being pulled from his body as he asked. Tracy turned toward him on the bed, her eyes bloodshot with tears. Of course, I want to meet my mother. How could I not want to meet her? But I don't want to leave you or the boys or Maddie. She sat up and threw herself into his arms. I truly don't know what to do. Andy sighed. If I could leave the ranch, I'd go with you, but I can't just leave my brothers and sister. I know. I'm not asking you to do anything. I'm just telling you how I feel. All my life I felt rejected, like I wasn't good enough to be loved by anyone, and now suddenly I have a mother who wants me, and a husband who wants me to stay. What can I do? She felt torn between her mother and her new family, but she knew deep down that her responsibility was to her new family, not to the woman who'd given her birth and abandoned her. Andy just held her close, letting her cry. Why don't you write to your mother? We can give the letter to Steve Chandler tomorrow. Tracy considered that for a moment before nodding. I can do that. It seemed like a good solution. It wouldn't be meeting her, but at least she would know that Tracy cared to meet her. She loved the idea of corresponding with her mother. That evening, after the children were in bed, she carefully penned a letter to her mother. She didn't even know how to start the letter. Dear Mother seemed way too familiar when she hadn't seen the woman in over 18 years. What was the right thing to do? Finally, she settled on, Dear Mother, I'm not sure exactly what to say to you. I've waited for 15 years to finally meet you, and now that you're ready, I'm newly married with a family to take care of. My new husband has 3 younger siblings that he cares for, and a ranch he can't leave, so I really can't make a trip out to Massachusetts to meet you right now. My heart breaks as I write those words, because I so desperately want to sit and talk to you and ask you all the questions that I've wondered about for years. I've married a good man. His name is Andrew Harvey, and his younger siblings are Francis, age 16, Arthur, age 10, and Matilda, age 7. Maddie is my little shadow and does everything with me. I truly wish I could come see you, but I can't abandon the family I've come to love. I would be happy to correspond with you, though, and I'm glad to finally be able to do that. I will give this letter to Stephen Chandler tomorrow, and I hope that you'll respect my wishes and write me in return. Sincerely, Tracy. Tracy set the letter on the work table and left it there. I need to get some things from the mercantile tomorrow anyway, so I'll go ahead and take it to town then. Andy walked up behind her and rubbed her shoulders, his hand soothing her. I'll go with you. There's no reason for you to face him alone. Tracy turned into his arms, wrapping her arms tightly around her husband. The children were there, but for once she didn't care. She kissed him softly. Thank you. I was hoping you'd offer. Asterisk. The long drive to town the next day had Tracy wiggling in her seat. You have ants in your pants? Andy asked, his eyes filled with mischief. Maddie, sitting between them, said, She doesn't wear pants, Andy. She's a girl. Tracy laughed as the words broke the tension she'd been feeling since he'd told her who the man was. Once they got to town, they went to the mercantile. Andy went straight to George. Do you know where the man who's been looking for Tracy is staying? George nodded. He's been at the boarding house. Andy took Tracy's letter. You do your shopping. I'll give it to him. Tracy smiled with relief. She really didn't want to have to tell the man why she'd decided to stay in Texas, instead of taking a train to meet her mother. Andy went to the boarding house for men and knocked on the door. When Mr. Jones, the proprietor, answered the door, Andy smiled. I have a letter for Mr. Stephen Chandler. Is he in? Mr. Jones stepped aside. He is. I'll go get him. When Stephen came into the room, Andy held out the letter. Tracy wrote her mother a letter, and we'd appreciate it if you could take it to her. Stephen nodded. I'd be happy to. Tracy looks exactly like her mother. He shook his head. When I first saw her, it was like looking into her mother's face. Andy sighed. There's no doubt she's the one then, is there? None at all. She doesn't want to go live with her? Tracy spent her entire life waiting for her mother to return to the orphanage and get her. She's been all alone feeling like she was unlovable all that time. She's finally found a place with me and with my family, and she just can't leave it. She'd have wealth beyond her wildest dreams. Andy shook his head. She's happier with feeling loved and wanted. Stephen nodded. I'll take her mother the letter. I don't think she'll give up, but I'll try at least. He looked as if he understood Tracy's decision to stay, but it was hard to tell. Thank you. Andy turned and left the house, walking back to the mercantile. There was another small mountain of supplies. He walked up behind his wife as she placed several skeins of yarn atop the pile. Do we really need all of this? He asked. Tracy turned to him and nodded. I want to get started on Christmas presents for all of you. I have a lot of sewing to do. And I've discovered a secret in the time I've lived with our family. You have? What's that? Tracy looked around as if she was about to share the location of a secret treasure. All of you like to eat. Andy laughed, rubbing his hand up and down her arm. She seemed a great deal happier today than she had the day before. That's very true. I gave him the letter. If Tracy was surprised by the quick change of topic, she didn't let it show. Thank you. She added 2 more things to the top of the pile. I think that's everything. Maddie stood behind Tracy, the gap where she'd lost her two top teeth showing through her grin. May I have a peppermint stick? She asked. Just one, please? Tracy smiled, having expected the question. Because you were so good, you may have one. Maddie quickly selected her stick while George used a pencil and paper to add up their purchases. Tracy tried not to think about the woman who was in Boston, wondering if she'd be coming to see her soon. She couldn't think about it. She was too busy with her new family. Chapter 6. Tracy had been in Texas for 4 weeks when she realized that she was carrying. She waited a couple of days for just the right time to tell Andy, but finally blurted it out in bed one night. We're having a baby. She watched his face carefully for his reaction. Andy's face slid into a slow grin. That's great. I wasn't sure you wanted a baby. You've never mentioned it, and you're already raising your siblings. Andy shrugged. Of course I want a child of my own. Well, since I've met you I do. I guess I never really thought about it much before, but I can't imagine not having a baby with you. He stroked her cheek gently, thrilled that they would have a child together. You're going to be a good mother. Tracy smiled. So, is that why you're always pouncing on me in bed at night? Andy shook his head. I do that because you're beautiful, and I can't seem to keep my hands off you. He showed her he was serious by starting to stroke her once again. How could any man be expected to not touch such a beautiful woman? She snuggled close beside him, wondering if this was how her mother had felt when she'd found out she was pregnant with her. So happy she couldn't imagine that life would ever not be perfect again. She put her hand over her belly, wishing she could already feel it kicking. She'd never wanted anything in her life as much as she wanted the child she was carrying. She couldn't imagine any circumstance where she would not keep her child by her side. For the first time in her life, she wondered what her mother could have been thinking to leave her. Was she not someone who felt motherly affection? They'd heard nothing yet from her mother, and she wondered if they would. She wouldn't be surprised if the woman just didn't want to mess with her after she rejected her, but Tracy had done what she needed to do for her own family. Surely her mother would understand that. Asterisk. Francis drove the wagon into town for supplies with Tracy and Maddie as passengers. Tracy was in her 5th month, and was thankful the weather was cooling off for her. November was proving to be a busy month. She'd finished all the canning and jam making the month before, and had thought November would feel like a rest, but she was working at making gifts for her family for Christmas. She'd never had a Christmas with people she cared about, so it was special for her. Andy was sweet and gentle to her, but still hadn't told her he loved her, and she wished the words would come. She couldn't make herself say them before he did, though. She had spent so long feeling unloved and unlovable, there was no way she'd ever be able to say the words first. She had to know that he felt them before she could say them to him. Her greatest sadness was that she'd never heard back from her mother. Apparently, the fact that she'd refused to go see her had been enough to make it so her mother didn't want her at all. Tracy tried not to care, but she'd felt like she was so close to having the mystery that was her mother solved. It hurt not to hear from her. She had never been told the woman's name, so she couldn't send another letter to try to find her. Maddie was doing very well with the schoolwork Tracy gave her. She was reading well and learning her sums as quickly as any child Tracy had ever seen. Tracy didn't feel like she was a qualified teacher, but apparently that didn't matter, because Maddie was learning. The 2 older boys were doing their lessons in the evening once the ranch work was finished for the day. The afternoon air was chilly, but not cold. Tracy and Maddie had shawls over their dresses, but there was no need to even wear a coat yet. In Massachusetts, there would have been snow by that time of year. Thanksgiving was just a week away, and Tracy was getting the groceries she needed to prepare a feast for her family. A strong wind blew up just as they got to town, and Tracy shivered a little as Frances helped her down from the wagon. She laughed as the door to the mercantile seemed to fight her, and she was barely able to get it open. Maddie hurried inside with her, ready to carry the shopping basket for Tracy. Andy was adamant that she carry nothing and take it as easy as she could while she was large and unwieldy. Tracy told him over and over that being pregnant was normal, and she could continue to do what she needed to do, but Andy wouldn't listen. When Tracy stepped into the store, George turned to stare at her, nodding his head toward the back of the store. "Did you get new fabric in?" Tracy asked with a smile. She didn't wait for his answer, but instead rushed to the back of the store to see what was new there. While her new family didn't have unlimited funds, they were much more wealthy than anything Tracy had ever experienced. She and Maddie each had several new dresses. Tracy was forever perusing the fabric display and finding more material to make dresses with. She'd also made new dress clothes for the men, but they bought their work clothes ready-made. She and Maddie rushed to the back of the store to look through the new goods, and Tracy stopped short. There was a new woman in town with hair the exact shade of red as her and green eyes to match. Her features were older, but she could have been Tracy's big sister or mother. Tracy didn't know what she'd started to say. What she could say. Was this her mother? Who else could it be? Maddie clung to Tracy's hand. "Tracy, is that your sister?" She stared at the older woman, trying to figure out who she was. Tracy looked down at the little girl. "You're my only sister, sweetie." Maddie seemed to instantly hate the other woman. Tracy wasn't sure if it was jealousy or what, but she knew she needed soothing. The woman spoke for the first time, her voice shaky. "So you are Tracy?" Tracy nodded, unsure what to say. "What did you say to the mother who abandoned you as an infant and then refused to respond to your letter you sent her as an adult?" What could she say? Her mother's eyes dropped to Tracy's expanded waistline before studying her features carefully. "I'm Cecilia Hebert. I'm your mother." She still stared at Tracy's face as if she were trying to memorize every feature. Tracy and Andy had not told the children about the possibility of meeting her mother, because they didn't want Maddie to be afraid she'd lose Tracy. The two had become closer than ever, and Maddie was just starting to come out of her shell with strangers and turn back into the precocious little girl she'd always been. They would do anything they could to keep her feeling confident about herself and not afraid of losing loved ones. Tracy felt like she was being too formal, but she didn't know how else to react as she lifted her hand to shake the other woman's. "I'm Tracy Harvey." Cecilia reached out and took Tracy's shoulders in her hands, pulling her close for a hug. "I'm so happy to meet you." Tracy held herself stiffly, feeling that she'd been rejected by this woman not once, but twice. Once as an infant and once 6 months before when she'd not answered her letter. Tracy nodded formally. "It's nice to finally meet you." She took a step back. "This is my sister-in-law, Maddie." Maddie looked at the older woman with wide eyes. "You can't be Tracy's mother. Tracy's an orphan." Her face was filled with disbelief in the other woman's words. Cecilia shook her head, a sad look on her face. "I left Tracy on the doorstep of the orphanage because her father died and I couldn't take care of her. It was either that or starve. Tracy would have found a way to keep you." Maddie turned away. "I'm going to pick out some fabric for the Christmas dress you're going to make me," she told Tracy. The little girl walked away, going to the nearby table with the fabric. Tracy looked at her mother, feeling nothing. All those years she'd dreamed of meeting her mother finally and flying into her open arms, being held tightly. Now, all she really wanted was to get this first meeting over with. "I'm sorry about Maddie. She feels very protective of the people she loves." Tracy stood with her fists clenched at her sides. What did this woman want from her? She obviously wasn't feeling motherly affection, or she'd have come for her a long time ago. Cecilia gave a half smile. Who can blame her? She reached out as if to touch Tracy's shoulder, but let her hand drop after a moment. I always planned to come back for you. Tracy nodded once. Yes, that's what the note attached to my basket read. The note had long since been destroyed as she had read it and reread it over the years. Every time she'd opened it, she'd been certain she would find some clue as to why her mother had left her and when she would be back. She had spent hours as a young child staring out the window of the bedroom she shared with 9 other girls at the orphanage, just waiting for her mother to drive up in a big white carriage and take her to her new home. Your father died in a fire when you were just a week old. I had no family. Everything we had was destroyed. I was a 17-year-old widow with a newborn baby. I didn't know what to do. I found a job in the city, but one of the requirements was that I not have a child. I wouldn't have been able to support us if I'd taken you with me. Cecilia had shrugged as if to say she'd had no choice in the matter. So you left me. Tracy wanted to say she understood, but honestly, she didn't. Maddie was right. If the house burned down tomorrow and she lost everything she had, including Andy and his brothers, she would find a way to keep Maddie and the child growing inside her. She couldn't do anything less. I didn't leave you. I was going to come back for you as soon as I had a better job. Cecilia's face begged for Tracy to understand. Tracy nodded. It's hard to find a job when you're young and female. I know that. She knew because she'd been there. Cecilia's face seemed to relax a little. So you understand why I did what I did. I loved you with everything inside me. I cried when I left you there on that doorstep. Tracy shrugged. It must have been difficult for you. She sighed. I'm sorry, but I'm not sure what you want me to do now. I've spent the last 18.5 years as an unwanted orphan. 6 months ago, I married and I have a family who loves me for the first time in my life. I'm not leaving them. But I can offer you and your baby so much more. My husband is a banker. We have a huge beautiful home in Boston with servants to take care of us. She eyed Tracy's hands, which were definitely red and calloused from the hard work she did every day. You'd never have to wash another dish. You'd never have to scrub your clothes against a washboard. I'd never be able to be with the family I love. She took a deep shuddering breath. Maddie may not be my child, but she's a child of my heart. The child I carry is going to grow up in a house filled with love and laughter. I didn't grow up in that kind of house. I will give my child everything I didn't have where love and laughter are concerned, even though that means that I won't be able to give them everything financially. Love is more important than all the money in the world. Tracy turned away from the woman and her fancy silk dress. She walked over to where Maddie was looking at the fabrics for her Christmas dress. She picked up a pretty green fabric and showed Maddie. What about this one? I think it would look good on you with your light complexion, and it would match my eyes. We could make matching dresses. Tracy did her best to act as if nothing had happened, but her hand was shaking visibly. Maddie clapped her hands together excitedly. I'd like that. Tracy picked up the fabric and took it to the front of the store while she picked through the groceries. Oh, you got some cranberries in, just in time for Thanksgiving. We need both potatoes and sweet potatoes as well. Maddie trailed along behind Tracy, carrying everything the older girl picked out. She watched Tracy with a look of absolute adoration on her face. When Maddie stopped in front of a display of crochet hooks, Tracy followed her gaze. Do you want to learn to crochet? Maddie nodded enthusiastically. Yes, please. I want to be able to make presents without your help for next Christmas. Tracy smiled, rubbing her belly. The baby had been kicking like crazy since they got to the store. With as fast as you learn, there will be no problem with that. She selected a hook and put it in the basket Maddie was carrying. "I'll start teaching you as soon as I can." Tracy paid for their things while Maddie ran out to the wagon to get Francis so he could carry everything out for them. After helping her into the wagon, Francis walked around to the other side to drive them home. "Thank you for helping," Tracy said with a smile. As they were about to drive away, she heard a yell. "Tracy, wait!" Tracy turned and looked at the woman standing beside her wagon. "Yes?" She held her breath while she waited to hear what her mother had to say to her. She thought everything had been said. "Would it be all right if I stayed in town for a while and got to know you?" Tracy nodded. "Everyone in town knows where we live. Just ask around. I'll be back on Sunday for church." She knew she should be friendlier, but really? How could she just develop feelings of love for a woman she hadn't seen since she was a few weeks old? It wasn't possible. She would have to get to know her like any other stranger. Cecilia nodded, a sad look in her eyes. Tracy felt as if she'd done something wrong by letting the other woman know her family came first, but she wasn't certain why. Surely the woman must understand that she'd had a life in the 18 years since she'd left her. They were halfway home before Francis asked the question that Tracy knew he'd been fighting not to ask since they'd left the mercantile. "Who was that woman?" "She looked just like you." Tracy sighed. "My mother." She didn't explain. At that moment, she never wanted to have to explain again. Francis looked at her with shock. "But, you're an orphan." "She left me on the doorsteps of the orphanage when I was 3 weeks old, always intending to come back for me, but the time was never right. She recently married and started looking for me around the time I moved here." Tracy kept rubbing her belly, thinking about the baby she carried and wondering how her mother could have left her for 18 full years. What exactly does she want? Francis's voice was incredulous, as if he was baffled by Tracy's mother showing up as well. Tracy wondered for a moment how much she should tell them. "She wants me to move to Boston. She said she can give my baby and me a better life." Francis stared straight ahead as he drove. "What do you think?" "I think I'm with the only family I've ever had. There's no way I'm going to go to another state to be with a total stranger. If she'd wanted to be a part of my life, she should have done it years ago. Not now." Tracy was afraid she'd sound cold to the younger man, but she wasn't going to apologize for feeling no emotion toward the mother who left her. Francis sighed with relief. He couldn't imagine how Andy would feel if she left. He wasn't willing to put up with his brother's bad moods that would surely result in her leaving. "Does Andy know she's here?" Tracy shook her head. "He knew she sent someone out to find me back in May." "May? This has been going on since May and no one said anything?" Francis's voice was filled with anger. Tracy had never heard any negative emotion from Francis and was more than a little surprised. "We didn't want to worry anyone. I knew as soon as I found out what the man wanted that I wasn't going anywhere." Tracy explained the decision not to tell them the best way she could. Francis still seemed upset that they hadn't said anything. "I still think you should have told us." Tracy sighed. "Maybe we should have. I didn't see a need for all of you to worry that I was leaving when there was no way I was going to do it." No more was said the entire way home. Francis unhitched the team and went in search of Andy. He didn't even carry all their new purchases inside before seeking out his brother as he normally would have done. Asterisk. Andy looked up from the fence he was mending to see Francis riding as fast as he could across the range. He knew he'd taken Tracy and Maddie into town that morning, so he wasn't sure what was making him so upset. Francis stopped in front of him, dismounting in one quick move. Andy, a good horseman himself, was always envious of Francis's way with horses. Andy had all the moves technically right, and did what he was supposed to do, but Francis was a natural. The things Andy had learned from a young age, Francis had just been able to do with no one teaching him. "What's wrong?" Andy asked, his face concerned. "Is something wrong with Tracy or the baby?" He couldn't bear it if something happened to one of them. It was hard enough losing his parents. Losing his wife or child would break him. Francis shook his head. "Her mother is in town." Andy felt all the color drain from his face. "Her mother came here?" "But she never answered Tracy's letter." "Why was she there?" Was she going to try to talk Tracy into leaving with her? He couldn't let her go. He couldn't. Francis sighed. "I didn't even know that Tracy's mother had magically appeared. Why didn't you tell any of us?" Andy shook his head. "We'll talk about it later. Is Tracy all right?" He walked to Francis's horse and quickly threw himself into the saddle. Meeting her mother had been so important to her that she'd taken the second rejection hard, even though she'd put on a brave face about it. "She seems fine." "I don't know." "Take my horse when you're ready. Finish the fence." Andy rode off toward the house, wanting to check on Tracy. Had she actually talked to her mother? Was she upset? When he got back to the house, he saw the two girls trying to unload the back of the wagon. Maddie stood in the bed and handed things down to Tracy, who made a small pile. There was no way she could carry it all in herself. Their food bill had certainly gone up since Tracy had arrived, but he wasn't complaining one bit. He hadn't had a single bite of beef jerky in 6 months. How would they go back to living the way they had before she'd come to them? Jumping down, he walked over to Tracy, taking her arm. "Are you all right? Did you talk to her?" Tracy nodded. "Yes, to both things. I met her and realized she's like every other stranger in the world to me. She gave birth to me, yes, but that's all she ever did." It was a strange feeling. "What do you mean?" Tracy tried to figure out how to explain it. "Well, my whole life I've dreamed of what it would be like to meet my mother. How I would see her and run into her arms and be held tightly. We would both cry and I would know that she'd always loved me and life just kept her away from me." Andy gave a half smile. He'd realized very quickly that Tracy was a romantic and got excited over every little thing. She would work up something in her head to be perfect and everything less tended to disappoint her. It wasn't like that? Tracy shook her head. "I didn't even know what to say to her. Or what to call her. Her name is Cecilia, but calling her Cecilia seems impersonal and rude. Calling her mother, it just doesn't feel right to me." Andy stroked Tracy's cheek. "You could start with Cecilia then." Tracy made a face. "It sounds so formal." She sighed. "Anyway, I told her I was happy here. That I have a family for the first time in my life, and I feel loved for the first time ever, and that I couldn't leave." "Good. I'm glad you stood up to her." Tracy bit her lip. "She said that she could give me servants and the baby, and I would never want for anything. I'd never have to wash a dish again." She laughed. "I have to admit, I like the sound of that part of things." Tracy did dishes 3 times a day without a single complaint, but Andy knew she hated them. Andy grinned. "She accepted that you weren't moving to Boston to be close to her?" "I think so. Just as we drove away, she said she's going to stay in town a while so she can get to know me better." Tracy shrugged. "I guess that's okay as long as she doesn't try to pressure me into leaving." Andy pulled her close, resting his cheek on top of her head. "I think it would be good for you to get to know her, but I don't want you leaving." Tracy chuckled. "I'm not going anywhere. I couldn't take Maddie away from her brothers." The grin she gave him told him she was teasing him somehow. He looked at her. "Maddie? If you did leave, she'd stay with me." "Oh no, she wouldn't." That girl is mine now. The look of ferocity on Tracy's face was almost comical. He laughed. You're not leaving, though, so it doesn't matter. She sighed, resting her head on his shoulder. I don't guess I could talk you into helping me unload the wagon, since you're here. She was not looking forward to carrying in even half of what they'd purchased, and she knew Andy wouldn't want her to. He was very protective of her and the baby. I think that's why Francis came to get me. He's tired of lugging your purchases. You're the one who doesn't want me lifting anything. She patted her belly, now very rounded. No, I don't. He pushed her toward the door. Go inside while I deal with this stuff. Tracy headed into the house to put things away as he carried them inside. She was glad he'd come home early. She was holding things together, yes, but she felt like she'd done something terrible with the way she'd talked to her mother. When Andy came into the house, she asked, Are you still planning on shooting a turkey for Thanksgiving? Andy nodded. We don't need it for almost a week, though. I know. I just want to make sure you haven't forgotten. She paused for a minute watching him. How would you feel if I invited my mother to eat with us on Thanksgiving? She'll be away from the people she loves on the holiday. She both liked and hated the idea of inviting her mother. Andy frowned. I hate the idea, but if it will make you happy, then do it. Tracy smiled, walking across the room to hug him tightly. Thank you. She couldn't abandon the woman as she'd been abandoned. He stroked her cheek. You're the one who has to make extra food. Asterisk. Tracy fixed Maddie's hair for church on Sunday morning, carefully arranging the braids she'd formed. You look so grown up with your hair that way. I think I'll leave the braids down so I can make you stay a little girl. Maddie giggled. You really think I look grown up with my hair this way? She obviously loved the idea of looking older, like most young girls. You look at least 9, Tracy fibbed, trying to conceal her laugh. Maddie walked around with her head held a little higher as she finished getting ready to go. Tracy walked into the kitchen, completely ready for church. She was going to have to make herself a couple of new dresses, because she couldn't let out the ones she had even another inch. She walked to the table where Francis and Andy were drinking coffee. I'm ready. Tracy was surprised her mother hadn't made the trip out to the ranch yet, but maybe no one had been willing to tell her where the house was. Or maybe she'd given up and gone back to Boston. Tracy was surprised by the sadness she felt at the idea of the other woman giving up. She wanted her mother to want to have a relationship with her, even if she herself didn't want one. She wanted, just for once, for her mother to care about seeing her and work toward it. She didn't understand why she didn't at least visit or write letters over the years. Tracy needed to understand what had happened during the years they'd been apart. For some reason, it mattered more than anything. You finally ready? Andy asked. He loved to tease her about how long it took her to ready herself for church every week. Tracy made a face. I'm waiting on you. As usual. They made their way out to the wagon. He'd sent Francis out earlier to hitch up the team, and Tracy had a big bowl of chicken and dumplings in the oven keeping warm. The dinner rolls she's made the day before were covered and ready to eat as well. When they reached the church, Andy helped Tracy down, keeping a casual arm around her waist. She was happy to have him beside her, especially since she didn't know when or where her mother would pop up next. Or if. There was a big if as well. As soon as they stepped into the church, her mother made a beeline for her. Tracy. Cecilia called. Tracy looked up as the older woman grabbed her and hugged her close. Tracy took a deep breath before pulling away. She didn't feel close enough to her mother to hug her. It felt strange being grabbed by her that way. This is my husband, Andrew Harvey. Andy, my mother, Cecilia Hebert. Andy nodded. It's nice to meet you, Mrs. Hebert. Cecilia looked at Andy for a moment, studying his clothes as if she thought he wasn't quite good enough for her daughter. Tracy said nothing, wanting to scream that he had stood by her, no matter how he dressed. "It's nice to meet you, too." Tracy bit her lip for a moment, wondering if this was the right time to ask. "I thought maybe you'd like to come out to our house and have Thanksgiving dinner with us." Cecilia's face lit up excitedly. "I'd love that. If there were a restaurant in this tiny town, I'd invite you to have dinner with me today." She obviously thought that not only was Tracy's new family lacking, but the town itself was lacking as well. Would anything be good enough for her baby? Before she could stop herself, Tracy said, "I've already made Sunday dinner, but you're welcome to join us." Andy stiffened a bit at her words, but immediately echoed the invitation. "Yes, you're welcome to eat with us." "I'd like that." Cecilia smiled happily. "I have a buggy that I borrowed for the duration of my stay. You'll just need to give me directions." "You can follow us out after church," Andy suggested. He knew he should have just drawn the woman a map, but he didn't want to waste that much time on her. There was something about her that he just couldn't trust. "I'll do that." Cecilia looked around for Maddie. "Where's your little sister-in-law? She was so charming that day I met her." Tracy stifled a laugh. Maddie had dismissed her mother out of hand. She'd not thought she was worth her time and attention, and it showed. "She's playing with the other little girls. She'll be along before church starts." Tracy was surprised to see the older woman slide into the pew beside her. Maddie usually sat at her side, and wouldn't be happy for the intrusion. When Maddie saw Cecilia in her usual spot, she squeezed in between Tracy and Andy. Tracy obediently slid closer to her mother to give Maddie a little more room, smiling at the girl's solution. After the sermon, everyone crowded around to meet Tracy's sister. When Tracy introduced the other woman as her mother, there were some very surprised faces. "You don't look young enough to have a child Tracy's age." Cecilia took the comments in stride. "Thank you, she does age me a bit, doesn't she?" She was obviously thrilled with the comments about how young she looked. Cecilia was a vain woman. Tracy didn't like admitting the woman was her mother, which surprised her. She'd always dreamed of having a mother for people to meet, but now that she didn't like it. She didn't feel like the older woman had really done anything to deserve being called her mother. On the way home, Tracy asked, "So what did you think of her?" Andy made a face. "She seemed as if she thought we weren't good enough for her daughter." He hated the idea that Tracy might actually be better off with the woman. She certainly wouldn't have to work so hard while she was carrying his child. Tracy nodded. "I got the same impression." "You are, though." She clung to Andy's arm as he drove. "I'm where I want to be." He smiled. "Well, I certainly hope so. Now that you're pregnant, you're kind of stuck with me." He winked at her, pleased that she was echoing his thoughts. "Good. I want to be stuck with you." Once they were inside the house, Maddie put on the apron she and Tracy had made together, and helped Tracy put lunch on the table. It wasn't a fancy meal, but Tracy knew that she was a good cook, and she wasn't ashamed to serve this simple meal to her mother. After everyone was seated, Andy prayed for them all. When her mother took her first bite of lunch, Tracy held her breath. She so badly wanted her mother to approve of her, even after her brave words and their years apart. "Well, I don't usually like chicken and dumplings, but this is quite good, Tracy." "Who taught you to cook?" Tracy shrugged. "Mrs. Spivey has been running the orphanage for as long as I can remember. She insists that all the girls know how to cook, clean, and sew. If they learn nothing else from her, they learn those 3 things." "Was it a good place?" Cecilia asked, seeming upset at having to ask the question. Tracy nodded. "It was. We weren't mistreated. All of us were given plenty of food. We had warm clothes. They were usually old and patched, but they were clean. We learned how to be good people there. Whether we wanted to learn it or not, we did. She sighed. For me, the biggest problem was people moving in and out. Most children are either adopted as babies or they are adopted as soon as they're old enough to be helpful. I couldn't be adopted, so I had to stay there and watch friends come and go. It got to the point where I wouldn't let myself make friends with the other orphans. It was too hard to lose them. She'd been lonely her entire life until she'd come to Texas. Of course she didn't want to leave. Why couldn't you be adopted? Cecilia asked. Tracy stared at her mother in disbelief. You left a note saying you'd be back soon. If there had been no note at all, I'd have been adopted out immediately. With the note, they had to wait until I was 18 to let me go. She shrugged. I couldn't go until I turned 18, but I couldn't stay beyond the age of 18 because of overcrowding. I had to become a mail-order bride so that I could time it just right. Cecilia stared at her daughter in shock. You were a mail-order bride? That's how you ended up here. Tracy nodded. Why did you think I was here? Why won't you leave then? These people are nothing to you. Tracy shook her head, simply unable to believe that the woman was talking so openly about the people she loved right in front of them. They're everything to me. They're the first people in the whole world who ever loved me. They want me to stay. I'm family to them. Cecilia looked offended by those words. I loved you. Tracy laughed softly. You left me. Maddie looked at Cecilia. You're not taking Tracy anywhere. I'll cut you if I have to. Tracy stared at Maddie in shock. You won't cut anyone. What a thing to say. Maddie looked down at the table, embarrassed by her words. You have to stay with us, Tracy. Her voice was soft, but Tracy could hear the anguish in it. Tracy reached over to take Maddie's hand. I'm not going anywhere, sweetie. Tracy had never noticed any trace of violence or negativity from Maddie, so she was stunned that the girl would say such a thing. Cecilia looked at Tracy. They do seem to want you around. Tracy grinned. I've never felt wanted by anyone in my entire life before I came here. My new family is just amazing. She smiled at Andy, making sure he knew that she was staying. Cecilia looked around her. You're living in poverty here, though. You could have so much more with me. She obviously believed it was better to be rich and unloved than to have all the love in the world with no riches. I don't want or need more. I have people here who love me. If your whole purpose in being here is just to get me to leave, then you might as well go back to Boston now. Tracy ate her last bite and walked to put her dish in the basin. She removed the cover from the cake she'd made for dessert and carried the cake to the table, along with a stack of plates. Are you all ready for dessert? She carefully cut the cake and handed out the pieces. They ate the dessert in silence, her mother obviously offended by her words. When they were all finished, Tracy got up to clear the table, watching as Maddie jumped up to help. They had become a good team in the past months, and Tracy no longer needed to ask Maddie for anything. The younger girl just did it with her. Every other guest they'd had in their home had helped clear the table, and Tracy was annoyed her mother sat where she was and watched as she did it all. She'd said she was once a maid, but Tracy couldn't imagine her mother helping anyone with anything. When she and Maddie were finished, Tracy sat back down at the table. So when did you get married? She asked. Cecilia smiled. Bert and I married 5 years ago. She had a dreamy look on her face that made Tracy think she was missing her husband. Maybe she had the ability to love after all. Tracy looked down at her hands, afraid any words she said would be rude. Why had her mother been married for 5 years and never come for her? She'd only left the orphanage 6 months before, So how could she possibly rationalize that? I see. Andy had no qualms about asking the question that was burning in Tracy's brain. Why didn't you go get Tracy then? She was close to you, and you knew exactly where she was. Cecilia glared at Andy as if she hadn't expected that question to be asked and considered it terribly rude. My new husband wanted us to take time to get to know one another first. Andy blinked a few times. Yes, I can see why starting a marriage with a child would be difficult. He looked over at Maddie and Arthur, who were sitting together in the corner of the room, talking in low voices and occasionally glancing their way. Exactly. It's difficult to get used to a marriage even without children. I'm glad you understand. Andy looked at the woman in shock, clearly unable to say anything else. Tracy lifted her head, her eyes spitting fire. I don't understand. I came out here knowing there would be 3 children when I got here. I never thought about not doing it because it would be harder. Did you have no maternal feelings at all? She knew her words were rude, but she simply couldn't hold them back any longer. Cecilia blinked a couple of times at the animosity in Tracy's voice. Of course, I did. I've spent my years wishing I hadn't had to give you up, but I had no choice. Tracy lifted her head, breathing deeply. You honestly believe that, don't you? You don't think you had a choice other than to leave me at an orphanage? What was your childhood like? It was a normal childhood, I guess. I lived in Virginia with my parents and 2 brothers. My parents were good people, but my mother died when I was 15, and my father and both brothers died in the war. Cecilia didn't have to say what war. The Civil War was the only war she could possibly be talking about. Virginia? They fought for the South? Tracy asked. It hadn't occurred to her that her mother could have been from the South. She didn't have an accent, but she'd lived in Massachusetts for years. Cecilia nodded. Yes, we were slaveholders, so they joined the Confederate Army. Slaveholders? Tracy asked. So you had a lot of money? Cecilia shrugged. Oh, I wouldn't say a lot of money, but we were well off, the same way most plantation owners in the South were at that time. She had a faraway look on her face. The war changed everything for me. Tracy nodded. How did you meet my father? Oh, Thomas was a Northern soldier. He was marching through town and they stayed at my family's plantation. I was still living there with my grandparents. I met Thomas when he came through and we married right off. He looked so dashing in his uniform. I'll bet it was hard for you to become a maid after I was born. Cecilia nodded. It was very hard. Thomas's family was poor, like yours, and I had to learn to cook and clean. I don't think we ate a meal that wasn't burnt the entire year of our marriage. She laughed softly, obviously not ashamed of the memory. I still can't cook to save my life. Thank God I have servants again. How long were you a maid? Tracy asked. Oh, I was a maid right up until I met my Bert, but I wasn't a maid who cleaned. She gave a delicate shudder. Oh, no, I was a personal maid to a young lady in Boston. She and I had been friends in Virginia before the war, and she'd made a better choice of husbands than I had. Tracy felt sorry for Thomas, wondering if Cecilia had been so blunt with him about his lack of wealth. Were you happy with Thomas? Cecilia shrugged. I was as happy as any woman could be while she's cooking and cleaning. I certainly was happy when I found out I was carrying you. She smiled at Tracy, leaning over to take her hand. I loved being pregnant. I loved the feel of you kicking inside me. You've been married for 5 years now. You don't have any other children? Cecilia shook her head. I haven't been able to have another for some reason. Bert wants a child badly. Her eyes were drawn to Tracy's stomach. I know you don't want to come home with us, But we'd happily adopt yours and raise it like you were meant to be raised. Tracy covered her stomach with her hands, her eyes filled with horror. You're not taking my baby. Go to an orphanage and find one. I assure you, there are plenty of unwanted children in every orphanage in the country. This child is wanted desperately by his parents. Tracy stood, saying nothing else as she left the room and went into her bedroom, closing the door with a snap. She leaned against the bedroom window and allowed her tears to fall. Despite her words, her mother's actions showed she had never wanted her. She'd never met a person who was so selfish in her life. She heard raised voices from the kitchen, but she didn't go out to see what was happening. She truly didn't care what was being said. All of her beliefs about the world were shattered. Her mother, the woman she'd waited for, was a truly selfish woman. She watched as her mother ran from the house and to her borrowed buggy. She hoped she would never see her again. Tracy sank onto the bed, lying on her side and holding her belly. I promise you, no matter what, I will not be like she was. Chapter 7. There was a quick knock on the door before Andy came into the room. He sat beside her on the bed, stroking her arm for a moment. I don't even know what to say to you. Tracy smiled through her tears. Not much to say, is there? He shook his head. I've never met anyone so selfish in my entire life. I'm so glad she didn't raise you. He couldn't imagine how his wife would have turned out if she'd been raised by the harridan who had just left their home. Tracy nodded, sniffling. I'm coming to believe that she really did do the best thing for me by leaving me at the orphanage. All of her dreams about her mother had been well and truly shattered. If she never saw the woman again, it would be too soon. There's no doubt in my mind she did the best thing. He sighed heavily. I told her she wasn't welcome back here and that the invitation for Thanksgiving has been rescinded. Tracy sat up and threw herself into Andy's arms. Thank you. I don't know if I could have told my mother I never wanted to see her again, but I don't. Andy was so good at taking care of her and doing what she needed him to do. If only he would give her the words of love she needed as well. Andy sighed. At least now you don't have to wonder what she's like anymore. You know. Oh, I know. Tracy looked at the wall for a moment. She looked down on us and everything we have. Nothing here was ever good enough for her. We are not of her class. How could a woman who put riches above all else have left her only child to be raised in an orphanage? It just made no sense. I know. It was obvious. He put his forefinger under her chin and lifted it up for a soft kiss. I think you made the right decision, staying here, by the way. Tracy smiled. I know I did. She rested her cheek against his shoulder. Is Maddie all right? How upset is she? She worried the little girl would be off crying. She needed to go and calm her down. Andy bit his lip. I forgot to tell you that part. Tracy raised an eyebrow. What part? What had happened while she'd been in her room crying? Maddie kicked Cecilia and told her she was an evil witch. Tracy felt the laughter rolling up inside her. She didn't. Oh, how she loved that little girl. She said that anyone that doesn't love you is evil and she doesn't ever want to have to look at her again. Tracy brushed the tears out of her eyes. I need to go out there. Tracy got to her feet and headed toward the door, obviously in a hurry now. She's fine. I promise. No, it's going to take me a while to fix dinner. We need to have beef stew and fresh bread. Andy smiled as he watched her get go. She was going to fix Maddie's favorite meal. His wife was an amazing woman. Asterisk. The next time Tracy went into town, George shared all the latest gossip. That woman that looked like you? She left. She came into town on Sunday spitting mad and demanded I open up my store. bought a few things, and left. He was leaned forward on the counter, the top of his head shining. Tracy nodded. I didn't think she'd still be around. She smiled, happy her mother was gone from her life for good. How was your Thanksgiving, George? She didn't want to keep talking about her mother. It made her sad. It was good. My son, Amos, got us a turkey, and we had a good feast. How about you? Good one? Tracy was convinced that George had opened a store so he could talk to people all day. His wife was quiet and shy, and Tracy doubted she had a whole lot to say. Arthur got a turkey for us, and Maddie and I made stuffing for it. It turned out really well. She smiled, leaning forward. Don't tell Andy, but it was the first turkey I ever cooked. I thought it came out really moist. She was proud of how well it had turned out. She'd been almost afraid of trying to cook a turkey. For some reason, it seemed like it was the hardest thing in the world to cook when you talked to other women about it. From what I hear from that family of yours, if you cook it, it comes out better than the way anyone else would ever make it. He winked at her with a smile. Tracy laughed. Don't listen to them. They just want me to keep cooking for them. She watched as he added up the items she'd chosen, including some white linen for baby clothes. She knew it was early yet, but she couldn't wait to start cutting them out and sewing them. You starting to sew for the baby already? George peered at her stomach. When are you due? Tracy nodded, her face lit up with excitement. In about 3.5 or 4 months. She patted her huge belly, happy to think about the time her baby would be there. That gives you plenty of time to get the sewing done. I'd have thought you'd still be rushing to finish Christmas presents, though. I got those finished last week. It was easy to do all the men's gifts, but I had to pretend to take a nap every day to get Maddie's done. Tracy grinned as she thought about the gifts she'd carefully handmade for her family. She knew they'd be excited to see them. Maddie came up behind her then. To get my what done? Tracy laughed down into the girl's smiling face. Would you like to know? She dropped her voice conspiratorially like she was going to tell the girl a secret, leaning forward to put her lips against her ear. Yes, I would. Please tell me. Maddie's voice was so excited, Tracy almost felt bad. I made you a Christmas present. They were still laughing as they walked out to the wagon. Andy sat on the seat, smiling down at them. You done? Ready for me to carry everything out? Andy had decided to accompany them to town for a while, worried that her mother would cause trouble. This was the first time they'd been in since the woman had been out to their house, and they had no way of knowing if she'd left town or stayed to cause problems. Andy wanted to talk to George for a moment when Tracy wasn't around anyway. Did we have any letters? He asked. Tracy made a face. I didn't think to ask, but I'm sure George would have told me if we did. She rubbed her belly. I'm getting hungry. Andy kissed the top of her head. I'll get the wagon loaded then. We can't have Junior starving to death. He always referred to the baby as Junior as if he knew it would be a boy. Tracy didn't mind. Boy or girl, she'd love it just the same. With as much as I eat, I don't think there's any danger of that. Her appetite had been voracious since she'd been pregnant. The first month or two she'd thrown up constantly, but since, she'd just been hungry. She had no other real symptoms besides the hunger, though, so she counted herself fortunate. Andy hurried into the store and stopped in front of the counter at the front. Tracy's mother is really gone? You're sure? I watched her get on the train with my own 2 eyes. George patted Andy's arm in a fatherly way. I promise, I'll send Amos out the second I see her or anyone else looking for Tracy. Andy breathed a sigh of relief. Good. I don't want to have to worry. I appreciate it. He shook the older man's hand as he carried the first of the packages to his wagon. Tracy spent the next month planning for Christmas. She had read about people who had pine trees in their house that they decorated with popcorn, so she had Andy chop down a pine tree and drag it into the house, building a stand for it. She and Maddie made popcorn and spent hours stringing it carefully. The five of them together trimmed the tree singing their favorite Christmas carols. When it was finished, Tracy felt tears pouring down her face. She loved starting traditions with her new family. All Tracy's life she'd dreamed of what it would be like to be part of a family for Christmas, and this year she was going to make the most of her new family. Tracy sat down with Maddie at the kitchen table one day, and the two of them spent hours with watercolors from the mercantile painting Christmas scenes on the plain brown paper she'd purchased to wrap gifts in. The only thing that bothered her was that there was no snow. She wasn't a huge fan of snow, because she hated being cold, but it just didn't feel like Christmas without the ground covering. She was sure she'd eventually get used to it, but it was going to take a few years. The church was having a big Christmas service on the evening of Christmas Eve, and when Tracy asked if they could go, Andy sighed. He wouldn't tell her no, with as excited as she was about the holiday. He'd always attended the service as a child, but since his parents had died, he hadn't had the desire to. They made the drive into town just as it was getting dark. Tracy had made a covered dish that Maddie was holding on her lap in the back of the wagon. They would have the service, and then there would be a potluck and time to fellowship. Everyone in the church had drawn someone else's name to buy or make a gift for as well, so everyone would leave with something special. Tracy had no idea who had her name, but she had her friend Abigail's, and she was practically bouncing with excitement. The previous week, when she'd gone to town, she'd run into her friend and tried to feel her out about what she wanted for Christmas that she didn't think she'd get. She didn't want her to know she had her name, though, so she skirted around the subject. Just when she'd given up on getting an idea from Abigail, the other woman had complimented her on her hat. Tracy had crocheted herself imitating one she'd seen in Massachusetts. Not many people in Texas wore winter hats, but Tracy had liked wearing it when she was in the wagon for a long time in the 40-degree weather. She had gone to the mercantile immediately after seeing Abigail and picked out a beautiful sky blue yarn that would be pretty with her friend's eyes. She'd had to work quickly, but it was done and wrapped. No one was allowed to tell who they had, even to family members, so she didn't know what the others had done, but she was excited to be part of it all. Andy helped her down from the wagon before the service, and all of them had rushed to put their gifts on the table where the others were. Tracy set the scalloped potato dish she'd made on the other table where all the food was before taking her seat. She was practically bouncing in her seat, enjoying a real Christmas for the first time in her life. As an orphan, there had always been presents, but they were usually used clothes or other cast-offs from the townspeople. These were real presents, and she was able to give something special to others for the first time. She didn't know why the orphanage hadn't organized something like this, where each of them could make something for one of the others. She considered writing a letter to Mrs. Spivey to suggest she do it in the future. The pastor told the Christmas story as some of the children from town acted out the story. Francis had said he'd been asked to be part of it, but he hadn't wanted to make the 2-hour round-trip drive every day for a week of rehearsals. After the service, they all helped themselves to heaping plates of food and desserts. Tracy was proud to see that her dish was gone before she even had a chance to get a bit herself. They moved all the pews and everyone sat at the tables people had carried in. Tracy sat between Andy and Maddie, so proud to be part of the Harvey family. After dinner, Tracy hurried to help with the cleanup. 3 different basins full of hot water had been carried in to wash the dishes, and another 3 were carried in for rinsing. The work was done quickly and efficiently, with all the women chattering about how excited their children were for Christmas. Tracy had told Maddie to go ahead and play with the other kids, knowing that there would be more than enough hands to get the job done. Finally, After the dishes were washed, everyone sat around the tables once again, and a group of girls, all around Maddie's age, were given the task of passing out the presents. They do it that way to reinforce the new readers, Andy whispered to Tracy. The kids have to read words they don't know, and match them up with the people that are here. How long has this been a tradition here? She asked in a whisper. With the way he'd balked at going, she thought it was the first year, before he said that. Andy smiled. For as long as I can remember. Some of my first memories are of Christmas celebrated right here in this church. When Tracy's present appeared before her, she looked at the label. Everyone was supposed to put who it was to and from on the package, but hers just said, to Tracy Harvey. She frowned. Who could it be from? And why didn't they want her to know? She waited until all the presents were set out and Maddie was once again beside her before opening her gift carefully. Inside was a pretty carved wooden box. She opened the box and there was a beautiful necklace inside. She let out a gasp and held it up in front of her. Andy was grinning at her. Do you like it? Oh yes. I don't know who it's from, though. There was no name written on the tag. Francis grinned over at Tracy. Oh, it's from Andy. He walked around trading names until he finally got yours. Drove everyone in the whole church crazy. He shook his head as he watched his big brother try to hide his embarrassment. Tracy turned to Andy with surprise. You did that for me? Andy grinned, taking the necklace from her to fasten it around her neck. Do you realize yet that I would do anything for you? His thumb rubbed against her neck after he fastened it. Tracy turned back to him and rested her forehead against his shoulder. I love it. Thank you. She watched as Maddie opened her present. It was a shawl for cold days. Tracy smiled. Who's it from? Maddie looked at the tag. George's wife. From the mercantile. She draped it around her shoulders happily. She had the shawl she and Tracy had made, but this one was a bit fancier and would be perfect for wearing on Sundays. Andy received a pair of gloves for working in the cold. Francis got a book of poetry, which surprised Tracy. Do you like poetry? She knew so little about the boys. Arthur was painfully shy, and she only knew Francis a little bit from their drives into town and back. Francis shrugged, blushing a little. I do like it a lot. Arthur received a green scarf that he proudly wove around his neck. Tracy made sure to remind the children to go find whoever had given them their gifts and thank them. Abigail came up behind Tracy and hugged her tightly. When I told you I liked your hat, I had no idea you had my name. Abigail was already wearing the hat. I adore it. It's just like yours, but yours is green. Tracy grinned. I'm partial to green because it matches my eyes. Her eyes found Maddie in the crowd wearing a dress identical to Tracy's. The two of them had labored many hours to get them just right. I love the matching dresses you and Maddie are wearing, Abigail said with a grin, following Tracy's thoughts. She needed someone like you to come along. I hope so. I needed her as well, to be honest with you. How could Tracy possibly explain what it meant to her to have someone look up to her the way Maddie did? She'd always felt like she was worth so little, but to this family she was everything. Whatever happened with your mother? Abigail asked. I don't mean to pry, but she was here one day, and then the next she just left. Tracy shrugged. She went back to Boston. I couldn't give her what she wanted. She didn't want to talk about it. She never wanted to talk about what her mother wanted from her again. What did she want? Abigail's face showed her confusion. Tracy shook her head. I'm just glad she's gone. I think she went back to Boston. Abigail asked no more questions, sensing that Tracy wasn't going to say anything more about it. When they got home that evening, Tracy tried to push the questions Abigail had asked from her mind. How could a woman ask for a child to adopt when she hadn't even raised her own? Asterisk. By the middle of March, their part of Texas looked like a paradise. The trees were in bloom and the grass was a beautiful green. Tracy had seen her midwife a few days before, and she was due any day. Tracy hoped it was soon, because moving around was difficult, and she felt like she was as big as a house. She knew it would all be worth it when she held her baby in her arms, though. Andy assured her every day that she was beautiful to him, regardless of how swollen with his child she was. Maddie was taking on a lot more of the chores, working to do the cooking by herself as much as she possibly could. Tracy had made stacks and stacks of small gowns for the baby to wear, and several little afghans and quilts. That baby is going to be the best-dressed child this side of the Mississippi, Andy said with a laugh. Tracy blushed in embarrassment, but she didn't really care what Andy thought. Her child would be loved and wanted. She was going to show him that every day in every way she knew how. Andy brought the cradle he and his siblings had slept in down from the attic, and Tracy carefully polished it and made it up for the baby. Everything was ready for the new arrival. It was just a waiting game at that point. Tracy did her best to keep her spirits up despite being unwieldy, but a couple of times it affected her mood a little. One time she snapped at Maddie, and as soon as the words came out of her mouth, she covered her face with her hand. "I'm so sorry, Maddie. I don't know what came over me." Maddie hurried across the room and threw her arms around Tracy. "I know you're tired. Andy said that having a baby inside you makes you grumpy and tired." Maddie grinned at Tracy as she said the words. Tracy let out a low laugh. "Well, I'm glad Andy warned you that I would be grumpy then." She wished someone had bothered to warn her. She'd thought something was seriously wrong until the midwife assured her that all women became short-tempered during pregnancy. Maddie sat down in the chair beside Tracy. "What can I do to make things easier for you? You already do so much. Just keep doing what you're doing." Tracy couldn't imagine asking the child to do one more thing. Already she was working from the moment she got up until she went to bed between schoolwork and housework. Tracy knew she was blessed to have her. Maddie smiled at the praise. "I can do more if I need to. Do you need to take naps every day now? Can I cook more?" Tracy hugged the little girl to her. "You're already cooking 2 meals a day. I can cook the third." She patted Maddie's shoulder. "I don't know what I'd do without you." Andy came into the house then to check on her. He'd made a habit of sending one of his brothers to check on her every morning, and he always came back in the middle of the afternoon. He was worried that she'd go into labor and have no way to get help. Tracy looked up at him with a smile. She'd been kneading bread for their supper, and had flour caking her arms and a small speck of it on her nose. He walked to her and took a clean cloth from the work table and wiped her nose. "How are you feeling?" "I'm doing fine. You need to stop coming home to check on me every day. I hate that I'm interrupting your work that way." Tracy had told him over and over that she didn't want him to constantly check on her, but she understood. "You and the baby are so much more important than my work." Tracy sighed. "I'm ready for all this to be over. I want to hold the baby in my arms." She knew she sounded petulant as she said the words, and at that very moment, she didn't care. Andy sat in a chair beside her while Maddie put the dough into a bowl to rise. "I know. It won't be much longer. The midwife said any day a week ago. I want it over with." She wasn't terribly nervous about the delivery, but she was certainly ready for the baby to be there and not to be pregnant any longer. "I don't blame you." He kissed her gently before getting back to his feet. "I need to get back to work. I'll be home in a couple of hours." Tracy smiled up at him as he walked out, sighing heavily. She felt so strange while she was pregnant. One minute she wanted Andy to stay with her and never leave, and the next all she wanted to do was scream at people. She was glad he remembered what it was like when Arthur and Maddie were born, or he'd think she'd lost her mind. "I want something sweet for supper," Tracy said. Maddie's face lit up. Tracy had been craving sweets, and the rest of them were benefiting from it. "I saw some ripe strawberries over by the chicken coop. Do you want me to pick some? We could have strawberry shortcake." Maddie always loved sweets, and Tracy tried to accommodate everyone's sweet tooth as often as she could, but for the last few months, she was making at least one sweet every day. Tracy grinned. "You know what I like." "That sounds really good." She got up to wash her hands before taking the milk pail from the counter. "We'll put them in here." The two of them went to the strawberry patch together, and Tracy smiled. "I didn't even know we had strawberries." Maddie smiled. "Mama liked them, and she planted 2 plants years ago. They've expanded." Tracy looked down at her pail. There was no way they could get all the ripe berries into it. "We'll pick what we can, and maybe after supper, we can all come out and pick more. Do you want to help me make strawberry jam tomorrow?" Maddie frowned. "Are you up to that much work? For strawberries?" "I'm up for anything." The two girls worked together to pick as many berries as they could make fit into the pail. When they were finished, Tracy whipped up a cake while Maddie added sugar to the strawberries. She couldn't wait for the treat that night. "Do we have enough cream saved for whipped cream?" Tracy asked as she slid the cake into the oven. Maddie nodded. "I think so. Let me go check." She rushed from the house to the cellar and went down it looking for the cream. She came back a few minutes later, holding up a half jar of the cream. "Is that enough?" Tracy looked at it. "It should be. It'll be enough for us, and the boys can fight over whatever we have left." When Tracy had first arrived in Texas, she'd been careful to only take sweets after the others had what they wanted. At this point in her pregnancy, though, she was more than willing to stab anyone who took her whipped cream with a fork. They had a simple supper of beans and cornbread, but when she pulled out the cake and the strawberries, she could see everyone was excited. She served them each a piece of the cake, and they all poured the amount of strawberries they wanted over the top. Maddie brought Tracy the whipped cream, and she carefully took what she wanted before passing it on. Everyone was good with the amount they took, so there was plenty to go around. No one asked why she got more than they did, because they all understood how she felt about sweets right then. After eating the treat, Tracy sat back in her chair and patted her swollen belly. That's what Junior needed tonight. It was late that night, after everyone was in bed, that Tracy's pains began. She clutched the side of her stomach and walked around the house a bit until the pain went away. Within a couple of hours, she woke Andy. He came awake with a jerk. "Is it time?" Tracy nodded, immediately getting up to resume her pacing. The midwife had told her that walking would help her labor to go faster, so she was more than willing to walk. She wanted the pain over with so she could hold her sweet baby in her arms. While Andy was gone, Tracy prepared the bed with the extra cotton she'd purchased and started water boiling. She wanted everything to be as easy for the midwife as possible. 6 long hours later, Tracy held her baby girl in her arms. "What should we name her?" Andy asked Tracy, stroking the baby's face with just one finger. The midwife was still bustling around them, cleaning things up. Tracy shook her head. "I was sure it was going to be a boy." They hadn't discussed a single girl name. "Me too." He wasn't disappointed, though. He loved the idea of having a miniature Tracy in his life. "What would you think of Edith?" she finally asked. She'd known a girl named Edith in school, and they'd been friends for a short while. He seemed to consider it for a moment before nodding. Edith. Edith Harvey. I like it. Their eyes met over the baby's head, and he smiled at her. Thank you for giving me a beautiful baby. You're not disappointed it's a girl? He shook her head. Of course not. She's perfect. Tracy sighed, staring down at the baby. She is. The midwife rushed in then. I'm finished here. She'd insisted on bringing her own carriage, and Andy understood why then. He wouldn't have to leave to drive her home now. Thank you for your help, Tracy said with a smile. I'll be back to check on you and the baby in a few days. Andy stood and walked the older woman to the door. We appreciate you coming in the middle of the night this way, Mrs. Borden. All first babies seem to come in the middle of the night. I expected as much. She went to her buggy and drove away. Andy sighed happily. How could life get any better? He had a good woman who cared about him and a beautiful baby. He couldn't see anything ever happening to cause frustration.